Hi, my name is Glenn Murphy. I am one of two presenters of this video series on how to market and harvest your woodlot for profit. My co-presenter is Dr. Reen Visser from the University of Canterbury. In video 7, Reen will look at your obligations under the Resource Management Act and how to protect the environment.
In the previous segment, we talked about the importance of managing safety, especially during forest operations. And within the industry, we often like to say that safety is number one. However, looking after the environment is also a number one priority that we should have. As a forest owner, as a woodlot owner, you have both a legal and we'd like to think also an ethical obligation to protect the environment that we're working in. So undoubtedly, when we harvest our timber, when we construct our roads and landings, we will have an impact. But if we do it well, timber harvesting is going to have a low impact on the environment. We're going to protect our waterways. We're going to protect the soils that we have on site. The legal aspects are very much covered by the law, which is called the Resource Management Act here in New Zealand. So the Resource Management Act sets out the principles and the core statutes associated with working in the environment, but the actual entities that have responsibilities under the Resource Management Act to make specific rules, guidances, and or require the application of resource consents for permission to work within the environment are our councils. We have both regional councils and district councils, and both of those entities are required to publish a plan, and it is within those plans that you will actually find the rules for timber harvesting, for carrying out earthworks on your site. So these resource consents are embedded in the Resource Management Act, and they're found, the reason for them, they're in the regional plans. In theory, at least, the Resource Management Act is an effects-based law. That means if you are not going to have what is perceived to be an impact on the environment, typically your activity may well be permitted. Okay, so in many regions of New Zealand, harvesting a woodlot is not perceived to be high risk, and it is simply a permitted activity. Okay, even though it is permitted under the new National Environmental Standard that came out in 2018, so it's referred to as the NES-PF, for all commercial harvests, there are a standard set of rules now that apply to all activities, even if you do not need to apply for a resource consent for that particular operation. So if you do need a resource consent, what it effectively is getting permission from the council to undertake an activity that is controlled, restricted, or discretionary. So for example, larger scale earthworks or timber harvesting on erosion prone terrain may require a consent. Once you have that consent, you have permission from the council to undertake that activity. Now, getting a resource consent, or whether or not you need a resource consent, is clearly your responsibility. And again, if you're engaging with a professional forester and or forestry company, they should have very good knowledge on what is required in your particular region for your type of operation. If not, do contact your regional and or district council, read their plans, but typically their field officers are available to give you guidance on requirements. We should note that resource consents can be both expensive in terms of the cost, in terms of preparing the information you need to apply for a consent, as well as the consent application in itself, and they can also be time consuming to obtain. So it is well worthwhile to get in ahead of time, make sure you have your harvest plans ready and submit them to the council for the consenting process. So managing the environment, the nice thing it's relatively logical in terms of what are we really trying to do when we're protecting the environment? What do we value? So the regional council will have stepped through this process effectively for you in your region, but there's a lot of common values that we have right throughout New Zealand: protecting our water quality, protecting our aquatic habitat, effectively our waterways, looking after the soils, both in terms of quantity, making sure that we don't have excessive erosion, as well as quality, making sure we don't impact on the soil's ability to grow, be it crops and or trees. So that's really about minimizing soil disturbance as well as protecting our waterways. There can also be other values that we cherish within our environment. For example, Maori heritage sites may well be identified within those regional or district plans. There can also be things like scenic values and landscapes. For example, if you're near an urban area, certain hills around the cities and or towns may be identified as having a specific scenic value, in which case there may be some additional restrictions around harvesting those particular areas. The other thing we should note is that within the Resource Management Act, people, or our societal values, as well as the economy, is recognised as being a value we need to protect. So it isn't all about preservation, it is also about being able to work in and on the land to look after our society as well as our economy. So protecting during the environment, we are typically referring to non-point source pollutions. So this is in contrast to where you may have a factory working in a city where you've got a chimney and or a pipe from which there is a discharge of potential pollutants. In our forest operations, the origin of our pollutants is quite hard to determine. It's a larger geographical area, and typically we have runoff that from accepted land use is harder to control. So here now, what I've introduced onto this photo is some of the impacts that we can have. So you can have erosion around those areas that we've disturbed, for example, for tracks or landings. We may have some oil that has been discharged around our processing area, especially with regard to the needles and or potentially the fertilizers. They could run off from the sites in terms of nutrients. Sedimentation is all about soil that enters the waterway and adversely impacts that. And then also, of course, we may have herbicides that we apply prior to the planting of the next rotation, and we need to be careful that that does not enter our waterways. Best management practices. So best management practices are designed to protect against non-point source pollution. So they're really chosen to reduce the impact from our common operations, and these best practices are developed over time as experience and research improves our knowledge. So we really use best management practices to avoid having a whole series of hard and fast rules that are very difficult to apply in a larger geographical area such as a woodlot and or a forest area that we are trying to manage. For example, here we're looking at this picture. Is this good? Well, again, it's important to step back and look at what we need for our forest operations. So we need to build roads, we need to build landings, but you'll find that one of the higher level objectives within our best management practices is to reduce the amount of soil disturbance for us to achieve our goals. Okay, so here, is this really a low impact road? Did we need to disturb this much soil just to build that road? And if not, then obviously we are not managing the environment in an appropriate way. Some of those guidances, there's a lot of international documents, but we have one in New Zealand. It's called the New Zealand Environmental Code of Practice. It's published by our New Zealand Forest Owners Association. So it really does, at the higher level, encourage you to establish your values and set the expectations for your land. But within that document, there's a whole lot of generic rules and guidances for all of our common activities, such as timber harvesting, road building, as well as stream crossings. If you wish more details, especially if you're undertaking a lot of earthworks, that is still one of the higher risk activities. There's actually a document called the New Zealand Forest Owners Association Road Engineering Guide. as well as the operator guide. Both of those documents are freely available, and they tend to have more of this picture type approach where you can see ticks and going, it looks like this, it's good, and also it'll have the crosses next to images where clearly it does not meet our expectations of best practices. Now, in certain regions, in quite a few regions, your council, especially if you're in a region that has a lot of forestry activities, they will typically publish their own set of guidelines as well. For example, the one you see in the bottom there is the Bay of Plenty one, erosion and sediment control for forest operations, and they will have some specific guidance around your drainage and or the cutoffs that you can put on track to avoid excessive erosion occurring. So things to focus on during harvesting: you don't want to be too strict with your contractor. The saying is you have to crack the egg to make the omelette. So there is always going to be some soil disturbance associated with bringing equipment in to harvest your forest. But what you really want to do is step back and say, is that level of soil erosion excessive? And also remember that what we're primarily interested in is making sure the soil stays on site and that we're protecting our waterways as we carry out our harvesting operations. So what we also want to do is the slash that's created, and in a New Zealand operation we do create a lot of slash, and so we want to make sure that that is stored in a safe place. Okay, so if the slash is stored, for example, on a steep slope leading down to a waterway, during a rainstorm that can get flushed off the hillside into the waterway and impact downstream landowners, that is not an appropriate outcome of your harvesting operation. So in summary, be engaged. It is your responsibility to protect the environment under the Resource Management Act. So you need to meet your legal obligations, but as a landowner, you really need to take a lead in setting the standards. So I think if you can communicate quite clearly to the contractor what your expectations are, then that will really help facilitate a higher quality harvesting operation. There's a lot of resources out there. That Environmental Code of Practice is free to download from the Forest Owners Association website, and it will have a lot of guidance on how they can best be managed.
This concludes video 7. In video 8, we will look at planning for the harvest of your woodlot. If you have any questions, please direct these to the email link shown below.